Hi everybody, my name's Brendan Malone. Welcome along to this presentation, Free Speech, Hate Speech and the Suppression of Truth. As I always like to say at the start of any online presentation, it's a real shame that we can't be together in person to have a more humane and connected dialogue, but thank goodness for the modern technology which allows us still to go ahead with this presentation regardless of the current limitations on us. So let's jump straight into today's topic and explore this question of free speech, hate speech, and the suppression of truth. Let me start by pointing out why I think free speech is so important. First of all, free speech is the practical outworking of the right to freedom of conscience. Your right to freedom of conscience is a very important human right, but conscience also has to be free to govern our actions, which includes our speech in the world. And so free speech is an important part of that. And if we are not free to actually speak according to our conscience, then our freedom of conscience has been limited. Number two, free speech involves both the rights of the speaker and the hearer. We often think of free speech as being just about my right, the right of the individual to say something. But in actual fact, I would argue it's not just about that. It's also about the rights of those who might hear what you have to say and their ability to engage with that. And why would that be important? Well, because that allows them to grow in the truth, to be challenged in their ideas, to come closer to the truth through a process of an inquiry, dialogue, disagreement, whatever may be entailed in that speech that's happening. But the point is, I would suggest that the hearer has rights in this all as well. And why would they have those rights? Well, I think that freedom, including speech, is essential to the pursuit of truth. And I can't pursue truth if information is not disclosed to me, if information is not allowed to be disclosed to me, or even if there's just a general, what you might call an undercurrent of fear that exists in a society where people are afraid because of the consequences to speak honestly in a society, that definitely hampers the pursuit of truth. It closes off and stifles inquiry. Speech is also essential to human flourishing. In order to flourish as a human person, I need to know what is good and true so I can conform myself to that and find a greater level of freedom and flourishing in my life. But I can't do that unless I first hear things. And so speech is essential to human flourishing. And if speech didn't have any impact on human flourishing, then why would you be trying to ban it? It only really makes sense that you would want to ban certain types of speech if you first believe and accept the fact that speech can have an impact on a person's human flourishing. And I would argue that if certain types of speech can negatively impact, so saying certain things can negatively impact human flourishing, then I would suggest to you that not hearing certain things can also negatively impact our human flourishing. And of course, honest self-expression is essential for authentic community. One of the hallmarks of cults is the fact that they control speech. And the members of cults are not allowed to say certain things. They're not allowed to speak freely amongst or around other members of the community. And this is a way of maintaining control. And when you've got an environment like that, a situation like that in a society, authentic community is stifled. It's extremely hard to form authentic community. And the only types of community you can really form are perhaps what you might call hidden communities. And there's a stifling effect to authentic community that happens. It is not good for a society to either have what you might call an Orwellian control, a real dystopian approach, or even just an undercurrent. It might not be as intense as people constantly being jailed or executed, but there is a constant state of fear where people don't speak truthfully because they're afraid, and so they keep everything locked away inside. The one other thing I'll say too about the right to freedom of speech is you often hear people making the mistake of claiming that freedom of speech is the most important human right. That's not true. Freedom of speech is not your most important human right. The most important human right of all is the right to life. It is the fundamental human right, is the cardinal human right, because every other human right depends on your right to life. If you are not alive, if you've been unjustly killed because your right to life has not been upheld, not been respected, then you cannot participate in any other human rights. So the right to life is the most important human right because every other human right depends on it. Free speech is still important, but it's not the most important, because if your right to life is not respected, you can't exercise the right to freedom of speech at all. Now, in response to this today, we are seeing more and more attempts at policing and controlling speech. So I thought it would be a good idea to unpack what I think are the ways in which speech is policed or controlled today. So first of all, and probably I think most serious, and really at the top of the list, certainly in most people's minds the most serious, would be state control, state censorship, the state, the government policing your speech. This might involve fines, it might involve imprisonment, it might even involve execution if you're living in a state that does that sort of thing to its people. But other ways that this happens that people often don't consider are things like practitioner licensing, which the state oversees. And so you might not be able to become a doctor or a psychologist if you hold and express views that are considered heterodox, that are considered heresy to particular prevailing ideologies. The next level of control and policing comes in the area of the economic. This is where someone might be denied a job or even sacked from a job if they express the wrong views. This might involve boycotts, where people target an organisation and try and financially punish them because someone associated with that organisation has said something that they disagree with. There is an increasing number of corporates who are now acting almost like a new clerical class and conducting their own sort of corporate inquisitions and policing and controlling and punishing people for the things they say. If you think about the Israel Folau incident, and by the way, I'm not here to defend the way he went about things, so we're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but there's a principle here, and it's important to understand that what happened in that case was you had a situation where one corporation went to another corporation because they didn't like what Israel Folau had said publicly on his social media, and then they asked for Israel Folau to be sacked. So this is an economic policing of speech. Now, here's the thing. There is a balance here because, of course, businesses have to run, and part of that is that their employees can't bring the business into a state of disrepute. And so their conduct, and that includes their speech, is part of that. And even away from the business, that does matter. However, increasingly we are seeing a type of employment and economic punishment and policing of speech that goes well beyond that sort of legitimate day-to-day business practice and sort of maintaining a healthy business and where things are not out of control and where things are not constantly being brought into disrepute. There is deplatforming. This usually happens where a speaker is cancelled. So an event is organised, a group finds out about it, and they do something to deplatform the speaker. So, for example, they might write letters to, if it's at a university, to someone who's in authority, and that person in authority might cancel the event. They usually do this citing some very spurious safety concerns, but that's a common tactic. Another one is where the event is allowed to go ahead. So what the groups who are in opposition do is they turn up and they might beat drums, blow whistles, stand up, scream and shout, or even pull the fire alarm on a building. And so you've achieved a type of deplatforming there as well. The person has lost their platform, their ability to speak publicly. And then, of course, there are things like targeting various private venues and to get them, putting pressure on them. Again, this is sort of often financial pressure and threats of boycotts and everything else, in order that they will cancel a pre-arranged booking and deplatform a speaker that way. Another form of policing and control we're seeing now is in the area of social media. I'll talk about this in just a minute, why this is so important. But you are seeing things like demonetization, people who perhaps might earn money, ad revenue, by advertisers advertising on, for example, their YouTube videos. And YouTube choosing to demonetize. I've experienced this myself. Certain topics, and if you present certain views, it doesn't matter that they're charitable. It doesn't matter that they're not nasty, that they don't single anyone out. Nothing that you would even consider illegal or even unvirtuous. The fact that you're even discussing a certain viewpoint is considered unacceptable for monetization, and you're not allowed to earn any revenue like you normally would on other videos. The Patreon page, which is a platform that allows people to accept donations from anyone, that has actually banned and rejected people from its platform. And again, citing the spectre of community guidelines and that have apparently been violated. But when you dig into it, you can't really find out what exactly it is the person's supposed to have done or how they have violated those guidelines. But there's a demonetization effect where people can't give them donations anymore. Throttling is another one where you might end up on a whitelist. And this is something where social media companies will effectively throttle traffic that goes to a particular person's platform. So not as many people can actually see or hear what they have to say about issues. And then, of course, there is just outright banning, which has become more of a thing in the last few years. There's some very high-profile ones, but there are a lot more behind that is not as high-profile, haven't attracted the mainstream media attention, but there's a lot of banning that has happened on social media as well. Again, usually citing the very loosely defined claim of violating community standards. Then, of course, at the very lowest level, we have insults or name-calling, anger, shaming people, low-level harassment like bombing the comment section on social media or trolling them and things like that. They're low-level. They're things that, most people can navigate sort of quite adequately, but they are still an attempt to try and control or police a person's speech. These are what you might call cancel culture. It's a popular phrase that's used a lot more now these days, but these things predate that by a long time. I've been involved in pro-life work for over 16 years now, and I can tell you that deplatforming on universities has been happening for, I think, as far as I can remember, it's probably over about 12, 13 years now that's been going on. And it's only really in the last 5 years that other groups of people have started to be targeted in that same way. So it definitely predates the term cancel culture. There's three things I think that are important to note about policing and control of speech. The first thing you notice is that none of these forms of control involve debating ideas. They're all intended to silence or to ridicule, to shut down, to stop the speaker from speaking. They're not about debating the ideas. They're not about creating a fair and just platform where ideas can be dissected and explored. They are simply about brute force dominance of another person and silencing them, stopping them from speaking. Social media, second point, is the new public square now. So being booted off social media is actually an important thing. The other thing about social media is that not only is it the new public square, but it's also now privately controlled by a tiny minority of people who all think very homogeneously. And they're all located in one very small area of the United States. And I think that that is something that we do need to confront. I think it is very concerning that the public square is controlled by corporations, and we wouldn't tolerate it outside of social media. And I think we need to actually have the same approach when it comes to social media, and to ensure that there is a legitimate level playing field where people are not being suppressed, policed, controlled, censored in a way that is unjust. And lastly, only one of these particular methods of control has any sort of substantive democratic accountability associated with it, and that's the state or the government control of speech. And that's kind of ironic because that's most people's red line in the sand. That's the one thing where they say, well, that's the kind of censorship that I don't tolerate, we can't have that, but I'm okay with everything else. They sort of treat the other stuff below that as if it's not censorship or it's not that big a deal. But in actual fact, a lot of damage, a lot of harm is done to people by those other forms of control, and yet there is no real public or democratic accountability and oversight and control that can be exerted by the people to ensure that this is not happening on an ongoing basis, which I think there's an irony in that. But I think it's important to understand those other things still matter, and they can do a lot of harm to people as well. You'll often hear people in relation to this say, well, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. Now, there is a truth in that, of course. You know, you say certain things at certain times, you're going to expect that there are going to be consequences. However, what people really mean when they say this is not consequences. What they really mean is freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from punishment. And so what they're really saying is that they don't really believe in freedom of speech, I would suggest. Because without freedom from consequences for saying certain things, you don't really have freedom. Imagine if I said to you that you are free to sit in that chair, or that chair, or even this one over here. There's 4 chairs here. You can sit in any chair you want here. It's totally up to you. And then I said to you, but if you sit in those 3 chairs there, and not that one, you'll be punished for doing that. You'll lose your job. Well, am I really free to sit in any chair I want? I'm not. I'm absolutely not free to sit in any chair I want if I actually want to keep making a living and feeding my family. So without freedom from consequences, without freedom from punishment, you don't actually have freedom. And what really people, I think, are proposing here, without even probably knowing it, is they're really talking about this idea that you should have freedom of thought and nothing more. So it's okay for you to think certain ideas and maybe to express them in places where no one else will ever hear you. So not on social media, not around crowds or audiences. But the moment you actually express those ideas where they are heard by other people and are reported back on, then yeah, you can be punished for doing that, and that's okay. You've had your freedom, and now we're going to exercise a punishment on you for doing that. I would suggest to you this is a big confusion of our age. It's been a long-standing confusion around the right to freedom of religion, for example, and the right to freedom of conscience, where people think that freedom of conscience, or they act as if freedom of conscience or freedom of religion simply means having religious ideas in your head and maybe getting together with a group of like-minded people in a building at some point, maybe on a Sunday morning or an ethics discussion group where you might all agree with that. But the moment you try and act on that in the real world, so for example, if you're a doctor and you say, well, I believe we should never kill innocent human beings, so I'm not going to participate in abortion. I don't want anything to do with that at all. I'm not even going to refer for that because I think it's a serious injustice. You've got large groups of people who think it's okay to punish you and that you should even lose your job or you shouldn't even be a doctor if you exercise that conscience, that right to freedom of conscience. And so you can see the same sort of thing going on here with freedom of speech. When people say, well, it's okay to punish you. You can say what you want, but it's okay for us to punish you in return. Really what they're saying is it's okay for you to think certain things, but the moment that you say them out loud where they can be heard by lots of other people, then you're in trouble. This is a situation which, by the way, I think will lead to an increase of what is often referred to as public preference versus private preference. It's a term that was phrased and popularized by Tamir Kuran and also by Václav Havel. Václav Havel is the Czechoslovakian statesman who oversaw the transition from Soviet Marxist control to democracy in Czechoslovakia. And he used to tell this famous story about a greengrocer living under the communists who had a sign up in his shop about supporting the Workers' Party, supporting the Marxist Party. And that was his public preference, but privately, he didn't believe that. He didn't believe that at all. So he had a preference that he exercised and spoke about in public. And then there was a whole lot of other things that he would talk about in private that he didn't dare express in public. And here's the interesting thing about this. The more you police speech, the more entrenched and sort of the bigger this phenomenon becomes of people not telling you truly what they really believe. Now, where it's interesting, and you see this being outworked, though, is in the polling booth and election time. That's why I think Trump got elected. Public preference, private preference. People who voted for Brexit. This is why Brexit happened. Same sort of thing. The polling all indicated, that things were going to go the opposite way. Scott Morrison, when he got elected recently, the same sort of thing. And that's why I'm quite intrigued to see what happens with our election here in New Zealand, because right now there is a lot of policing of speech going on and people being accused of conspiracy theorism or of being a public danger simply for disagreeing with or raising questions about the statements that are constantly being made by the government about COVID and about the solution or the response, what response we should have to that. There's an increased policing going on. And in that sort of environment, what you tend to see is people keeping their real preferences private. And so it may play out in the polling booth. Who knows? It'll be interesting and fascinating to see whether it has any sort of impact here. But this is the reality of it. People actually start to keep to themselves a whole lot of private ideas. And in public, it can seem like everyone's in agreement, but in actual fact, that's not the case. Now, I would suggest that we need to engage with this issue. And we need to engage urgently with this issue. The Israel Folau incident, I think, should have served as a major warning to those of us living in this part of the world about how serious this has actually become. And now it's right on our doorstep, and it's only going to become more of an issue for us. People who are religious believers. I absolutely, for me, there's no escaping that fact. Because I'm not here to endorse what Israel Folau did, the way he went about things. I think there are much better ways to go about and to conduct yourself than the way he did on this issue. But there's an important principle here. And there's also something important that a lot of people seem to have missed and failed to understand here. All Israel Folau did at the end of the day was post a transliteration of a passage of Scripture from the New Testament. That was deemed to be hate speech by a large percentage of people in society. And even I saw Christian ministers who attacked Folau over this. And it seemed to me that they weren't really thinking through this issue properly. Now, I get it. The way he went about it is certainly something that can be critiqued. However, when you've got a Bible verse that is now deemed to be hate speech, that has some pretty serious implications, and you need to realize that going forward, that is going to have even more serious ramifications. That idea is only going to get more entrenched, and there are likely to be more outcomes, direct outcomes and direct impacts upon religious believers, in this case the Christian church, as a result of this. You see, freedom of speech isn't just about stopping offence, and the idea of hate speech and punishing people for their speech isn't just about trying to protect people's feelings. I would actually suggest that what's really going on here is this is about world building. This is about people who understand that ideas shape beliefs and that beliefs shape actions in the world. And these are people who I think want to build the world in their own new image, and they can't even tolerate these ideas existing because they view them as a threat to how they would like to see the world actually be. So what this means is there's no hiding on the peripheries. You can't just sort of hide on the peripheries and carry on, you and your mates talking the way you wanted to. There is more of an encroachment, an increasing encroachment upon our private and our public life in order to control what we think and what we say about issues. And in this country, hate speech laws are coming. The Labor government has already said that they are working on hate speech laws. And so those are likely to be put forward at some point to be voted on. We don't know what the final shape of those will be, but this is something we all need to be aware of and we need to engage with. So, in engaging with this, what should a Christian response to the question of free speech actually look like? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I think there's some important points that we need to consider when thinking about this issue. First of all, number one is the whole concept of freedom. So this is freedom of speech, freedom of expression we're talking about, and I've already talked about freedom of conscience. But how do we understand freedom within Christianity? Because there is a difference here. The culture of our day talks about freedom as if it means choice. Those two words are used interchangeably, but that is not how Christianity understands freedom, because I would suggest to you that's not what authentic freedom is. Authentic freedom is not license. It's not permissiveness. It is not choice. It's not the ability to do anything you want to. Authentic freedom instead is found when I submit myself to what is good, true, and beautiful. Authentic freedom is the freedom to do what is good, true, and beautiful. And when I submit myself to what is good, true, and beautiful, I find a greater level of freedom in my life and a greater level of human flourishing. Imagine your life is like a piano, and there's two ways that you can approach that piano. One way to approach the piano would be to say, well, I can say freedom equals choice, and I just do whatever I want. I'm not going to submit myself to your stupid, outdated laws of music, and you can't tell me that I have to put my fingers on certain notes to play a D chord. I'll put them wherever I want. And I'm not going to delay gratification so I can spend time learning my music theory and practicing my piano. I'm just going to get on that piano and do what feels good. It's all about choice. My body, my choice. And I'm bashing away on that piano. I'm doing whatever I want. It might feel good. I might get some pleasure out of it for a bit. But at the end of the day, all I'm doing is making a cacophony of noise. I'm not really free. I'm doing whatever I want, but I don't really have freedom. Because you see, there's another way to play a piano. The other way to play a piano is to say, I think there's a right way and a wrong way to play the piano. And so I'm going to figure out and I'm going to learn what these traditions of music actually are. I'm going to allow those traditions to inform my conduct and my behavior. I'm going to delay gratification, not go out partying every Friday night so I can spend that time instead learning my music theory and practicing. I say a small no now so I can say a much bigger yes later on. And after a while, if I approach the piano and I treat a piano like that, what happens is I actually start to find my freedom. I have the ability to make beautiful music. I can play Bach or Beethoven. I can play jazz, I can play R&B, I can write my own compositions. I can actually start to compose my own symphonies. You see, this is the level of freedom and flourishing that I find by approaching the piano in this particular way. Now, our life is like that piano. And so for our life, there's two ways that we can approach it. We can say, well, I'm just going to do whatever feels good, my body, my choice. Or if I conform myself to what is good, true, and beautiful, then I find a greater level of freedom. So for Christianity, choice and freedom are not the same thing at all. Secondly, for Christianity, evil doesn't have rights. It's important to understand this. We often see this played out today in a very sort of clear way as people who talk about the issue of abortion, for example, and they will say that abortion is a reproductive right. It's my reproductive right. No, it's not. There is no right, there is no human right at all, and certainly no legitimate, even if you want to try and construct a legal one, there's no legitimate right to do evil, to deliberately end the life of another human being. And so evil has no rights. It is goods and truth that are the things that have corresponding rights. So that's important to understand. And we see this played out within Christianity when you think about clearly in the speech arena, when you think about the issue of blasphemy and heresy. These are two sins in the life of Christianity that are intolerable, and they are things that carry very, very serious punishments with them. Blasphemy is even included in the Ten Commandments. right from the very beginning of the church. In fact, before the New Testament is even finished, we have heretics who are starting to proclaim the heresy of Gnosticism. And the church, the Christian church, very clearly condemned that heresy and said it's a lie, and that anybody who espouses that, who speaks that heresy and believes it, is actually separating themselves from the authentic heart of Christ. They have separated themselves from the Christian community. They believe something totally different now. So evil has no rights. It's not about my choice to do whatever I want. Authentic freedom must be grounded in what is true. And Scripture is very, very clear, and it takes issue. There's a lot of scriptures we could have looked at around the whole issue of our speech and how we conduct ourselves when it comes to speech. But let's just look at a couple now of these scriptures and the way in which Scripture takes this very seriously. From Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and this is where I was talking about the Ten Commandments, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So it's a pretty serious thing. It's in the commandments, and that's speaking. To blaspheme involves speech. Secondly, from the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, verse 29, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So, your speech, you will be held accountable for your speech. Matthew 15:11, it is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. Again, our speech and the corrupting nature of that. And there is, a right and a wrong. There is a moral and an immoral. There is accountability here. And this is one of the big ones from the book of James, and it's something that gives me shudders every time I think of this. It starts by saying this, book of James chapter 3, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. Look at the ships also, though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. The power of speech. Scripture talks very clearly about this. What I'm trying to say here, and the point I'm trying to make here, is that the idea of free speech absolutism is not a Christian concept. Now, there are people who would argue that they think it should be a political concept, but it's not a Christian concept. We don't believe that you just say whatever you want, whenever you like, without accountability. So that's important. I think it's an important point to start with. Another point that's really important, and when we think about speech and from a Christian approach and how we might do this on the whole question of, should we have hate speech laws or not, is that laws must be moral in and of themselves. It's no good just to say, well, we want to create a law to produce a really good outcome. The law itself must also be moral, not just the outcome that you want to achieve. So the end and the means that you use to achieve that end, so in this case you're using the means of the law, must both be good. And I would argue that there are situations where using the law to resolve that situation actually creates an evil means. It's the wrong thing to do because the law is too blunt, the law is too disproportionate, and therefore it will do a lot of harm. It will do more harm than good will actually be achieved. And so the law is the wrong way to go about things. And I would argue that this is true when it comes to policing speech. There is a very, very narrow band, I believe, where the law does have a role to play. So someone used their speech to try and incite a riot or try and incite murder or mass murder or whatever it might be. Yes, that is something that I think quite clearly we can say this should be something that can and should appropriately be punished, and the law should be involved in that sort of scenario. But once you start to move outside of that, where someone is not using speech to invoke criminal conduct or to do criminal things, then you start to find yourself, I think, on really, really thin ice. And I think you've got a problem there. The law is too blunt, it's too disproportionate, and therefore it's extremely harmful and is actually going to create more harms than it will resolve. Here's something I said about free speech about 2 years ago. I posted this on Facebook, and I think this is a very prudent approach to take. In my humble opinion, when discussing free speech, we shouldn't be using the term hate speech. It lacks the necessary clarity and objectivity for such an important debate. Instead, we should be talking about banned speech, and those who wish to classify certain speech as banned speech, so in other words, that's criminal, it would be punishable by the law, should be required to prove the consequential harm, so actual substantial harm will happen, that will occur if such speech is not banned, and also that banning that speech will not actually lead to greater harm than leaving it unbanned would. Without this basic truthfulness and precision in the debate, we are already well on the way down a dangerous Orwellian black hole where merely disagreeing with someone or disrupting their intellectual or emotional equilibrium, in other words, giving them a bad, hurt feelings or emotional disruption, can be labelled as hate speech and invoked as justification to deny a person the legitimate right to freedom of expression. And I think this is extremely important. And like I said, when you start using the law in this way, I think there are very real harms that will result. So what are some of those harms? Well, first of all, I would suggest to you that the common good will be harmed. If you create laws on the statute books around what people can and cannot say that move beyond just, inciting criminal behaviour, then what happens is you start to create a climate of fear, I believe. And people are fearful about speaking truthfully and freely. And that is not good for the common good. For the sake of the common good, I think we need to have the freedom to actually speak our minds and to speak without fear. Freedom of conscience is also harmed by this, I would suggest, because what we see, and this will happen here, it's happening overseas, is wherever you institute these kind of laws, there's expansion that starts to happen, and the expansion happens because they're so subjective. Once you start introducing the idea of hate speech, and you ground that speech, you're moving out of actual criminal conduct, incitement of criminal conduct, you're now moving into the space of emotions and psychological beliefs. And it becomes extremely subjective. And that's why we're seeing situations like in Europe, there's been a couple of different comedians who have been hauled before human rights tribunals. They're a type of legislative court and have been punished for telling jokes. Now, it doesn't matter how offensive that joke is. I believe it's a completely disproportionate overreaction and also probably a waste of valuable legal resources and court resources to be punishing people for telling jokes. But that's happening, and that would happen here too, I would argue. It also would do serious harm to individuals and families, and this is what these other methods of policing do as well. People would lose their livelihoods, they would lose jobs. People would have a type of record, a criminal record if you like, that would follow them around. These are pretty serious things. The ability to actually earn money to feed your family. The ability for individuals to follow a chosen career path freely without interference just because they don't always hold the same views as people who are also there's some of their other colleagues, or maybe they just don't, their colleagues do hold them but they don't speak up about them. That's a very serious thing. And of course I would suggest that this just creates a greater fragility in society, and fragility always leads to tyranny. In fact, when you've got to the stage where you are using the law to try and protect people from emotional or psychological upset, I think you are infantilizing citizens in a very serious way, and you are treating them with such a fragility that can only become more entrenched. And that fragility just leads to more and more tyranny because people become more fragile and they start to look for more and more reasons, if you like, more and more areas of fragility where they want the state to protect them from, and they start deferring to the state. And that power is handed to a small group of individuals. And so when we're fragile, when we're not robust, we're very vulnerable in this regard. Any law that you make, I would suggest to you, and particularly in this case we're talking about around speech, must always fail safe. What do I mean by that? Well, in engineering, when you have a fail-safe, what that means is that any device or anything that is engineered or created, when it fails, it must fail with safety in mind. It must fail in a way that is safe for people around that device or that thing. So, for example, if you have an electronic access control system that controls and locks, electronically all of the doors in a building. Now, let's say there's a power cut, there's a burglar alarm, and then there's a power cut. Well, in that situation, you probably want the actual alarm system to fail so that all the doors stay locked, just in case someone has cut the power to try and get into the building. But if there is a fire alarm and then the power goes out, you need that alarm system to fail safe differently. What you want it to do is you need it to fail safe. You need it to actually unlock all the doors so people don't get trapped inside and burned to death. So if it's going to fail, it needs to fail safe. Now what that means is there is a possibility that it's not a fire, that it's a burglar, and that all of a sudden they've got access to the building. But you must always fail safe. So that's what you should do. And I would suggest to you the law should be the same. So what that means is that the law should always fail safe in this regard. And when it comes to the idea of policing people's speech, that is not a law that is failing safe. That is a law that is going to actually fail in a very harmful way and do a lot of damage in society to individuals, to families, and to other groups. And I think that's a real problem. Now, a law around speech, quote unquote, that fails safe, I think, is ultimately one which is actually going to have to tolerate people being emotionally or psychologically disturbed or upset by the things other people say. It's going to have to fail in such a way that it's going to have to put up with people saying horrible and nasty things. Because in order to fail safe and to ensure that we're not doing greater harm, we need to keep the law out of that particular space. Now, just a couple of other points to finish with. One thing that you'll often hear people saying, particularly those who are pro-free speech, is they will say sunlight is the best disinfectant. And what they mean by that is that we should expose these ideas to the sunlight and we should let them have their airing. And if we do that, better ideas, the truth, will be brought to the fore, and these ideas will be counteracted, they will be overcome, because sunlight, exposing them, is the best disinfectant. And if you lock them away in dark little corners of the internet or in secret, they just grow and fester away. Now, there is a certain truth to this, I believe. There is a certain truth that if you are heavy-handed, then what happens is people start to convalesce in secret, and things can start to happen that you don't intend if you're too heavy-handed. However, I think it's important to actually point out that this is not entirely correct. Yes, sunlight is definitely a good disinfectant, but sunlight isn't just a disinfectant. Sunlight is also a very effective growth promoter. And so if you expose certain ideas to sunlight, they won't actually die or be disinfected. They could actually grow. And it's important to understand this. And the reason I'm saying this is because I want to finish by highlighting what is the bigger underlying issue here. This isn't just about freedom of expression and hate speech laws. It's about the type of society in which this is all taking place. And there is a bigger problem here. And the bigger problem here, when you think about free speech and hate speech laws, is that we are now living in a culture of moral relativism. We have rejected the idea of objective truth. So in a culture of moral relativism, whose truth, quote unquote, becomes the standard to govern and to punish and to police people? Which truth are you talking about in a culture of moral relativism? And what you realize pretty quickly is this isn't about truth at all, because remember, we've rejected truth. All truth is subjective according to the moral relativist doctrine. So the only option then is the people in power, or who wield the power, will get to decide what you can and cannot say. It's really about power, not truth, that determines this. So you either end up with a democratic tyranny. 51% of people say you should be punished for saying that thing, and that's it, you get punished for it. Or you end up with some sort of small governmental, legislative or policy-making tyranny where a small group of people dictate for the rest of us. And this is what happens when you have no objective goodness, truth and beauty, or no objective standard for goodness, truth and beauty, when you embrace relativism and you say everything is subjective. And that's the culture we're living in. But it's not just that. We're also living in a culture where virtue has been lost. Not just the practice, but the promotion of virtue, the elevation and celebration and the encouragement and the training of virtue into our lives. So many people are broken and dysfunctional and desperately searching for meaning and for context. And one of the biggest things is no one's ever taught them how to live a virtuous life, because when you live a virtuous life, you actually start to find those things because you're looking beyond yourself, you see. And that's fundamentally important. So virtues like humility are essential. Prudence, love, temperance. When you think about speech, these are all hugely important. Having the humility not to think that you're right and try and bulldoze over everyone else with your speech. Having the prudence not to say certain things in certain ways because it lacks prudence. Having the love to say things that you have to say, even hard truths, with charity. And having the temperance so that you're just not always saying things, or it might not be the right time now to say that particular thing. These things, they really matter, but we're living in a culture that's lost sight of them, and that is the real way that you address this problem. If you want to fix the problem of people saying ugly, nasty things, you need more virtue. Now, instead, what we've got is a culture of radical individualism instead of care for the common good. So instead of saying, well, I should think about how my actions might affect the common good, more often than not now, we talk about my body, my choice. We've just been through this with the euthanasia debate. people say it doesn't matter how it affects the vulnerable members of the community. It's about my body, my choice. So this radical individualism instead of caring for the common good and how I conduct myself in the community. But here's the thing, that radical individualism is now ultimately proving itself to be the naked emperor when you think about the idea of imposing hate speech laws. Because what you're saying is, on the one hand, it's all about radical individualism and relativism, but then on the other hand, we will allow one individual to dominate and control another individual when it comes to their speech, and that other individual will be punished. So this whole thing it's the naked emperor, the emperor with no clothes on. You see, what we really need here, and I think the authentic solution to this is not a law, it's self-giving love. We need more virtue, more people willing to engage in acts of self-giving love, and that includes the way that they speak. That is the way to resolve the problem of vile and reprehensible speech. That's all I really want to say, so thank you for listening.